The summer air along the Chesapeake carried a stillness that felt earned, as if months of movement and uncertainty had gathered themselves into a single breath. Soldiers waited, ships crept along the horizon, and commanders studied maps worn thin by hope and calculation. No one spoke of destiny. What unfolded there was quieter than legend suggests, a convergence of patience, timing, and pressure that would decide not just a battle, but whether an idea called America would endure. By 1781, the American Revolutionary War had entered its seventh year. What began as resistance along colonial roads and town greens had grown into a global conflict involving empires. The British Crown, led by King George III, still commanded formidable forces, yet its strength was stretched across oceans. In North America, British troops occupied key cities but struggled to bring the rebellion to an end. The American cause, directed politically by the Continental Congress and militarily by General George Washington, had survived but not yet secured independence. The war's outcome remained uncertain, balanced between exhaustion and resolve. The setting for the final act emerged gradually. British General Charles Cornwallis, an experienced and capable officer, had spent months campaigning across the southern colonies. After victories in South Carolina and setbacks in North Carolina, he moved his army north into Virginia. His goal was practical: to disrupt American supply lines, weaken resistance, and position his forces where they could be supported by the Royal Navy. Cornwallis chose the small port town of Yorktown, situated on a peninsula between the York and James rivers, believing its access to the sea made it defensible and strategically sound. Cornwallis's desire was not glory but security. He needed a place where his army could rest, resupply, and coordinate with British naval forces. Yorktown offered anchorage, open ground for fortifications, and the expectation that the Navy would control surrounding waters. From his perspective, it was a temporary position, a holding point until larger strategic decisions were made. He did not intend to fight a decisive battle there. The war, he believed, would continue elsewhere. Across the American lines, George Washington faced a different calculation. For years, he had pursued a decisive engagement that could alter the balance of the war. The Continental Army had endured defeat, retreat, and scarcity, yet Washington understood that independence would not be secured through survival alone. A clear victory over a major British force was needed, one that would break political will in London as much as military strength in the field. Yorktown, if circumstances aligned, offered such an opportunity. The obstacle had always been naval power. Britain's Royal Navy dominated the Atlantic, allowing British armies to move, resupply, and escape as needed. American forces, even when successful on land, could rarely trap their enemy. Washington had learned this lesson repeatedly. Without control of the sea, victories remained limited. The American army could pressure, harass, and endure, but not decisively conclude the war. The shift began with coordination rather than combat. France, now formally allied with the United States, had committed troops and ships to the conflict. French General Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Weimar, Comte de Rochambeau, commanded experienced soldiers stationed in the north alongside Washington. More crucially, a French fleet under Admiral François-Joseph Paul, Comte de Grasse, was operating in the Caribbean. The question was timing. If French naval power could be brought to the American coast at the right moment, British assumptions would fail. In the late summer of 1781, communication across oceans and distances aligned with unusual precision. Washington and Rochambeau learned that de Grasse planned to sail north with his fleet. Rather than attack British forces in New York, as British commanders expected, Washington made a quiet but consequential decision. He would march his army south toward Virginia, combining with French troops to confront Cornwallis at Yorktown. The movement was conducted with speed and secrecy, misleading British intelligence and preserving surprise. As American and French forces moved into position, Cornwallis continued fortifying Yorktown. Earthworks were constructed, artillery placed, and defensive lines prepared. The British Army numbered roughly 8,000 men, including regulars and German auxiliaries. They were professional soldiers, disciplined and experienced. Yet their confidence rested on a single assumption: that the Royal Navy would protect them from encirclement. That assumption would prove fragile. In early September, the French fleet arrived in the Chesapeake Bay. When British ships attempted to challenge them, the resulting engagement, the Battle of the Capes, ended without decisive destruction but with strategic clarity. The British fleet withdrew, leaving de Grasse in control of the waters. Cornwallis was now cut off by sea. Supplies, reinforcements, and escape routes were blocked. The geography that once promised security now became confinement. By late September, American and French armies completed their encirclement of Yorktown. Washington commanded the combined land forces, numbering approximately 17,000. The siege began methodically. Trenches were dug, artillery positioned, and batteries constructed. This was not a dramatic charge but a measured tightening. Each day, Allied guns pounded British defenses, weakening fortifications and morale alike. Inside Yorktown, conditions deteriorated. British soldiers endured constant bombardment, limited rations, and growing uncertainty. Cornwallis attempted to maintain order and hope, but the situation grew increasingly constrained. A nighttime attempt to ferry troops across the York River and break out was thwarted by weather. The window narrowed. The siege, guided by European military practice and American persistence, advanced step by step. One of the most critical moments came with the assault on two key British redoubts, small fortified positions that protected the main defensive line. American troops, including Alexander Hamilton and French soldiers, attacked simultaneously. The fighting was brief and intense. The redoubts fell, allowing Allied forces to advance their siege works closer to the British lines. The end was no longer theoretical. It was visible, measurable, and approaching. Cornwallis faced a choice with no favorable outcome. Continued resistance meant further loss of life without realistic hope of relief. Surrender carried profound consequences, not only for his army but for British strategy as a whole. After days of deliberation and failed attempts to alter his position, he requested terms. On October 19, 1781, British forces marched out of Yorktown and laid down their arms. The surrender at Yorktown did not formally end the war, but it effectively decided it. News traveled slowly across the Atlantic, but when it reached Britain, the political impact was immediate. Support for continuing the war collapsed. Parliament debated, ministries fell, and negotiations began. Britain still possessed military power, but the will to use it against a now clearly viable United States had ebbed. For the Americans, Yorktown represented validation as much as victory. It demonstrated that the Continental Army, once dismissed as temporary and ill-equipped, could coordinate with a major ally and defeat a professional British force in a decisive engagement. It justified years of sacrifice, endurance, and uncertainty. Independence was no longer merely declared, it was secured in practice. The historical impact of Yorktown extended beyond American shores. France achieved its strategic aim of weakening Britain, though at significant financial cost. Spain and the Dutch Republic, also at war with Britain, adjusted their positions accordingly. The global balance of power shifted, not suddenly, but unmistakably. An empire had been checked, and a new nation had proven itself capable of survival. Yorktown's importance lies not in spectacle but in convergence. It was the product of long endurance, careful planning, international alliance, and momentary opportunity seized with discipline. No single leader or army acted alone. Washington's patience, Rochambeau's cooperation, de Grasse's timing, and the soldiers' endurance all mattered. Remove one element and the outcome becomes uncertain. For those who fought there, Yorktown was not an ending but a transition. Many soldiers returned home to hardship, unpaid wages, and unresolved questions about the nation they had helped create. The war's conclusion did not solve every problem. It opened a new chapter filled with challenges of governance, unity, and identity. Yet the battle's meaning endured. Yorktown demonstrated that independence could be defended not only by belief, but by coordination and resolve. It showed that empires could be resisted when opportunity met preparation. It transformed a rebellion into a recognized nation. The Battle of Yorktown decided America not because it was the largest battle of the war, but because it closed the final path back to the old order. After Yorktown, the question was no longer whether the United States would exist, but how it would define itself. The answer to that question would take generations. But the moment that made it possible was shaped quietly, patiently, and decisively along the banks of the Chesapeake.